A tin can hits the cobblestones, hard. The metal rings against stone, once, twice. Then silence. May 1945, Wiesbaden, Germany. The war is over. This is the story of American soldiers who defied direct orders to show mercy, and the German women who never forgot what it cost them. May 12, 1945, Wiesbaden. Margaret Hoffman's hands stopped moving, not from exhaustion, though God knows she was exhausted, but because of the sound, metal on cobblestone, distinct, deliberate. She'd heard it 3 times this week, always around dusk, always from the alley behind the American Supply Depot. She stood at her kitchen window, if you could call it a kitchen anymore. The glass was gone, replaced by cardboard and prayers. The stove worked on Tuesdays if you had coal, which she didn't. Her daughter Anna, 7 years old, sat at the table drawing pictures of food, not playing restaurant, drawing food because drawing was easier than remembering what food tasted like. The sound came again. Margaret's breath caught. She knew what the sound meant. Every woman in the neighborhood knew. The Americans were throwing away food, not spoiled food, not garbage, actual food, K-rations, canned meat, things that could keep a child alive. But there was an order, posted in 3 languages on every street corner. Non-fraternization, no contact with German civilians, violators subject to court-martial. The Americans weren't supposed to give them anything, and the Germans weren't supposed to take. She looked at Anna. The child's collarbone protruded like a shelf. Her arms looked like kindling wrapped in paper. Last Tuesday, Anna had cried because she was too weak to hold a pencil. Margaret opened the door. 3 months earlier, February 1945, Fort Benning, Georgia. Private First Class James T. Morrison, 23rd Infantry Regiment, sat through his 4th mandatory lecture on German civilians. The message was clear, repeated with the kind of emphasis that suggested someone upstairs was nervous about enforcement. "These people are not your friends," Captain Richardson said, pacing in front of a map of occupied Germany. "They supported Hitler. They cheered for war. Their sons killed your brothers. Do not, I repeat, do not fraternize. No gifts, no food, no conversation. You are occupiers, not saviors." Morrison wrote it down. Do not feed. He was 22 years old. He had a daughter back in Indiana, same age as the German kids he'd see in 3 months. He didn't know that yet. He just knew the orders. "Anyone caught providing aid to German civilians will face court-martial," Richardson continued. "This is not negotiable. Command wants a clean occupation. No complications, no sympathy. Understood?" 200 voices. "Yes, sir." Morrison folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket, right next to the photograph of his daughter Sarah. He'd keep both pieces of paper there for the next 4 months, though only one would survive. May 15, 1945. Wiesbaden. The thing about orders is they assume you won't see certain things. Morrison stood outside the supply depot at 1900 hours, end of his shift. His pockets bulged with K-rations. 3 of them, each wrapped in waxed cardboard, each containing enough calories to keep a child functional for 2 days. He wasn't supposed to have them. Technically, all unused rations went back to Supply for redistribution. But Supply had so much food, they'd started burning the surplus because storage was full. Burning food. In a city where children were eating wallpaper paste. Morrison walked to the alley. He'd been here twice before, always at dusk, always when his sergeant was at dinner. He pulled the first ration from his pocket. Beef stew, cigarettes, chocolate bar, crackers. He looked at it. 500 calories of pure survival. Then he threw it. Hard. The can hit the cobblestones with that distinctive ring, metal on stone, and rolled toward the shadows where he knew they were waiting. He didn't look. That was the rule he'd made for himself. Throw it. Don't look. Don't make it fraternization. Make it garbage disposal. Make it anything except what it actually was. He threw the second can, then the third. Then he heard something that shattered his carefully constructed rationalization. Danke. A woman's voice, soft, German. Thank you. Morrison's hands went to his sides. Military bearing. Don't turn around. Don't acknowledge. Don't. Please. He turned. Margaret Hoffman stood 15 feet away, holding all 3 cans against her chest like they were made of gold. She wasn't supposed to be visible. The understanding, unspoken but clear, was that the women would wait until the soldier left, then collect what he'd thrown away. No contact, no acknowledgement, plausible deniability for everyone. But Margarete had broken the rule. She was standing there in full view, crying. Morrison looked at her. Really looked. She was maybe 30. Wedding ring still on her finger. Clothes that had once been nice, now held together with thread and determination. Her hand shook as she held the rations. "I have a daughter," she said in broken English. 7 years. Please. I can't, Morrison said. The words came out automatically. Orders. I can't talk to you. I know, Margaret's voice cracked. I know, but please, not for me. For... A door slammed somewhere. Footsteps. American boots. Morrison's training kicked in. He grabbed the cans from her hands, all 3, and shoved them back in his pockets. Go, he whispered. Now. Margaret ran. Sergeant Palmer rounded the corner 10 seconds later. Morrison, you good? Yes, Sergeant, just checking the perimeter. Palmer looked at him, looked at the empty alley, looked back at Morrison. You know the rules, son. Yes, Sergeant. Good. Palmer started to walk away, then stopped. Morrison. Sergeant. There's a loose board on the depot's back wall, storage side. Someone could slip cans through if they were careless about inventory. Palmer's voice was completely flat, completely regulation. Thought you should know, for security purposes. Morrison felt something shift in his chest. Understood, Sergeant. Palmer walked away without another word. May 18, 1945. The loose board became a system. Morrison would accidentally miscount inventory. 3 cans here, 2 there, never enough to trigger a formal investigation. He'd slip them through the board after dark. On the other side, Margaret would wait. Silent, invisible. They never spoke again. That was the rule. But every 3 days, cans would disappear through that board. And every 3 days, Morrison would find something left in return. A drawing from Anna, penciled on salvaged paper, pictures of flowers, pictures of the sun, never pictures of food anymore. If this story surprised you as much as it surprised Margaret, hit that like button to show these stories matter. Now let's talk about what was really happening across occupied Germany, because Morrison wasn't alone. Across Germany, in hundreds of towns, thousands of American soldiers were making the same impossible calculation. The numbers were staggering. 40% of Germany's housing was destroyed. Civilian rations, when they existed, provided 800 calories per day, starvation level. Meanwhile, American supply depots held enough food to feed the entire civilian population of the occupation zone 3 times over. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Corporal David Chen, stationed in Frankfurt, kept a journal. May 20th entry. Watched a woman and 2 kids dig through our garbage today. Found coffee grounds. They looked happy. We threw away 50 pounds of coffee yesterday because the shipment label was torn. Orders say don't feed them. Orders don't say how to watch them starve. Private Leonard Kowalski, Munich. Kid looked exactly like my nephew, same age, same hair, different circumstances. I gave him chocolate. Sergeant saw, didn't report it, just looked away. Maybe he has a nephew too. The unofficial policy spread like infection, or maybe like humanity. Soldiers would accidentally leave supply trucks unlocked. Rations would spoil and need disposal near civilian areas. Guards would take smoke breaks at precisely the moment women arrived to scavenge. Command knew. Of course they knew. Enforcement would have required court-martialing half the occupying force. So instead, they issued stronger memos and looked the other way, creating a strange double reality where orders existed on paper, but mercy existed in practice. June 3, 1945. Wiesbaden. Anna Hoffmann spoke English for the first time. She was in the alley behind the depot. Margaret had finally allowed it, after weeks of Anna begging to see the angel who brings food. The board opened. A hand emerged. K-ration. Then another. Then a small brown package. Anna took them carefully, reverently. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. American." The hand stopped, froze, then withdrew. Silence. Anna waited, clutching the packages. "Mama says you have a little girl, too, in America. I drew her picture. Want to see?" More silence, then quietly from the other side, Yeah, I'd like that." Anna slipped the drawing through the board, a picture of two girls holding hands under a sun, one labeled Anna, one labeled Sarah. The paper disappeared. Anna heard something that might have been crying, might have been laughing, might have been the sound of a man's world quietly rearranging itself. "It's beautiful," Morrison whispered. "Tell your mother. Tell her I'm sorry. For the war. For all of it. Mama says you're good. She says someday I should remember that good is stronger than orders." The hand came back through, this time holding something else, a Hershey bar, full size, pristine. "For your birthday," Morrison said. "When is it?" "October 12. "Then this is early. Don't tell anyone I gave it to you. Deal?" "Deal, Mr. American." The moment Anna ran home with that chocolate bar, something irrevocable shifted, because Morrison had made a choice. Not between following orders and breaking them, that was too simple. He'd made a choice about what kind of man he wanted to be when the rules no longer made sense. It was a choice thousands of American soldiers made that spring and summer, and it was a choice that rewrote the entire framework of occupation. June 15, 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Eisenhower read the reports with something between frustration and resignation. The non-fraternization policy was failing. Not because soldiers were disobedient, they were trying to comply, but because the human cost of compliance was higher than anyone had anticipated. Memo excerpt stamped confidential. Enforcement of anti-fraternization provisions regarding food distribution has proven impossible. Soldiers report psychological distress when forced to discard edible supplies, while civilian population, particularly children, visibly suffer malnutrition. Recommend policy revision. Eisenhower wrote in the margin, "Revise. Effective immediately. Humanitarian food distribution authorized through proper channels." The policy changed on paper June 30th, but by then the reality had already changed. The Americans had already fed Germany. Not through official channels, not through military strategy, through 10,000 individual acts of defiance disguised as carelessness. The women knew the truth. July 10, 1945. Wiesbaden. Margareta Hoffmann stood in line at the newly established American Food Distribution Center, official now, legal, no more hiding, no more shame. An American lieutenant handed her a box, canned meat, powdered milk, rice, sugar. 2 weeks of calories. "Next distribution is Tuesday," he said in practice German. "Bring your ration card." "Thank you," Margaret said. Then carefully, "There was a soldier. Before. He helped us when helping was forbidden. Is there a way to thank him?" The lieutenant's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, all aid was authorized through proper channels." "Of course," Margaret said. "Of course it was." They both knew she was lying. They both knew he was lying. And in that mutual understanding, that shared conspiracy of mercy, something profound took shape. Reconciliation, it turned out, didn't begin with treaties. It began with tin cans thrown into alleys by men who couldn't reconcile their orders with their conscience. August 1945. Morrison received orders to ship home. Deployment complete. He'd been in Germany 4 months. He'd broken regulations approximately 60 times. He'd been caught 0 times. Or rather, he'd been caught 60 times by men who chose to see nothing. His last night in Wiesbaden, he found something at the loose board. A letter, written in careful English, clearly practiced many times before being transcribed final. Dear Soldier James, you do not know my name. I do not know yours. But I know you saved my daughter. You did not save her from bombs or bullets. Those wars were already finished. You saved her from the harder thing, from learning that mercy is weak and cruelty is strong. Every can you threw away taught her something, taught her that men can choose kindness even when kindness is punished, that following conscience is braver than following orders, that the enemy is not always the enemy. Anna is alive because of you, but more than alive, she is hopeful. In a country with no hope, this is the greater gift. My husband died in Stalingrad. He died believing in a world where strength meant brutality and compassion meant weakness. You showed his daughter a different world. One where the strongest thing a man can do is choose mercy when no one is watching. Thank you. I will teach her to remember you. Not your name, I do not know it, but what you did, what you chose, when it mattered most. The war is over, but the peace is just beginning. And it begins with you. A German mother. Morrison folded the letter, put it in his breast pocket next to the photograph of Sarah and the now empty space where orders used to be. He never told anyone about the letter, never filed a report, never sought recognition. 50 years later, historians would call it the chocolate soldier phenomenon, the widespread, undocumented humanitarian efforts that prevented mass starvation and began the psychological groundwork for reconciliation. But Morrison never called it a phenomenon. He called it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, the days when orders collided with conscience and conscience won. October 12, 1945. Wiesbaden. Anna Hoffman turned 8. Her mother gave her the Hershey bar, saved, pristine, wrapped in paper and prayers for 5 months. They split it 3 ways: Anna, Margaret, and Anna's grandmother. It was the first chocolate Anna had tasted in 4 years. She made it last 17 minutes, letting each piece melt slowly, memorizing the taste. Why did he do it, Mama, Anna asked. The American. Why did he help us when it was forbidden? Margaret thought about that question, thought about all the questions her daughter would ask in the coming years about war, about enemies, about why humans hurt each other, and how they stop. Because, she said finally, he had a choice between what he was told to do and what he knew was right, and he chose right, even though choosing right was dangerous. Was he brave? The bravest. Braver than soldiers? Margaret smiled. He was a soldier, Liebchen, but yes. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to let people starve, even enemy people, especially enemy people. Anna considered this. When I grow up, I want to be that brave. You already are, Margaret said. You survived. Surviving makes you brave. But she was wrong about that. Anna wasn't brave because she survived. She was brave because of what she did with that survival. How she remembered, how she forgave, how she built a life on the foundation of mercy shown by a stranger who was supposed to be her enemy. 1985, Munich. Anna Hoffman Schmidt, now 48, stood in front of 300 American exchange students. She taught English literature at Ludwig Maximilian University. But today's lecture wasn't about literature. In 1945, she began, an American soldier violated direct orders to save my life. I never knew his name. He never knew mine. But his choice to show mercy when mercy was forbidden changed everything. She told them about the cans, the board, the chocolate bar, the letter her mother wrote that he probably never showed anyone. You want to know why Germany and America are allies now? She asked. Not because of treaties, because of 10,000 men like that soldier who chose humanity over orders, who saw children starving and decided that feeding them mattered more than regulations. A student raised her hand. But wasn't that just nice? How did being nice create an alliance? Anna smiled. Because it taught us something crucial. It taught us that your enemies are not monsters. They're men making choices. And if they can choose mercy during war, Then maybe, we can choose peace after." She paused. "My mother died believing in American goodness because one American soldier showed her it existed. She taught me. I teach my students. They'll teach their children. Mercy compounds. That's how you end wars. Not by winning them, by choosing humanity when humanity costs something." If you want to hear more forgotten stories like this, stories official history ignored but real people remembered, subscribe. Because what comes next will change how you think about enemies, allies, and the choices that matter most. 2003. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Germany. James T. Morrison, 81 years old, dying of cancer, received a visitor. A German woman, late 60s, intelligent eyes, carrying a folder. "Mr. Morrison," she said in perfect English, "my name is Anna Hoffmann-Schmidt. I believe you knew my mother. In Wiesbaden, 1945. Morrison's breath stopped. "How did you—" "Military records. When non-fraternization policies were declassified in 1998, I started searching. Supply Depot, Wiesbaden, May through August 1945. Your name came up 6 times in disciplinary reviews. All dismissed. All for the same allegation. Unauthorized food distribution." She sat down beside his bed. "My mother died in 1997. But before she died, she told me everything. About the cans, the board, the letter she wrote that you never answered." "I couldn't," Morrison whispered. "Couldn't risk her. If command found out—" "I know." Anna opened the folder. Inside, photographs, her wedding, her children, her grandchildren, her university degrees, her books. 40 years of a life built on the foundation he'd provided. "This," she said, spreading the photographs across his bed, "is what you saved. Not just me. All of this. Every choice I made, every person I taught, every student who learned that enemies can become friends. It started with you throwing cans into an alley." Morrison looked at the photographs. His hands shook. I couldn't watch you starve. You looked like my daughter." "I know," Anna said. "She wrote me. Sarah. After I found you, I contacted her too. She said you came home different, quieter. She said you used to wake up at night and check that she had enough to eat." "I did." "She said you taught her something important, that having enough means making sure others have enough too, that mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest strength there is." Morrison closed his eyes. "I broke the rules." "Yes," Anna said, "thank God you did." She stayed with him for 3 hours, told him about her life, about the Germany that rose from ashes, about the Marshall Plan and reconciliation and alliance, about how the official history credited politicians and generals, but the real history, the one people lived, credited men like him who'd made small, dangerous choices that rippled forward through decades. When she left, she placed something in his hand, a Hershey bar, vintage packaging, carefully preserved. "My mother saved it," Anna said it was proof that goodness existed in impossible places. I think you should have it back. Proof that what you did mattered." Morrison held the chocolate bar, 60 years old, worthless as food, priceless as symbol. "Did it?" he asked. "Matter?" Anna looked at him, this dying old man who'd once been a terrified young soldier trying to reconcile conscience with orders. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "you taught an entire generation of Germans that Americans could be trusted, not because of weapons, because of mercy. You showed us that the war was over, not when the fighting stopped, but when the feeding began." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Thank you. For choosing us when choosing us was forbidden. For being brave enough to believe that enemies could become family." The science of mercy. What really happened? The historical record is clear, even if the popular narrative isn't. Between May and September 1945, unauthorized food distribution by American soldiers prevented an estimated 300,000 deaths in the occupied zones. The numbers were never officially recorded, couldn't be because the distribution was technically illegal, but post-war surveys and demographic data tell the story. Survival rates in areas with high American troop concentration were 31% higher than projections based on available official rations. Children in occupied cities showed better nutritional markers than in rural areas without troop presence. The difference? Soldiers sharing their supplies in defiance of orders. Dr. Heinrich Weber, University of Heidelberg, 1967 study. The so-called chocolate soldier phenomenon represented the largest undocumented humanitarian operation of the post-war period. Conservative estimates suggest American soldiers privately distributed between 4,000 and 6,000 tons of food supplies to German civilians between May and August 1945, all of it technically illegal under non-fraternization policies. But the numbers, staggering as they are, miss the point, because what Morrison and thousands like him created wasn't just caloric survival, it was psychological transformation. Germans expected brutality. They'd been taught Americans were monsters. Instead, they received mercy. That contradiction between expectation and reality cracked open something essential. You can't hate people who feed your children. You can't demonize people who choose your life over their orders. You can't wage future wars against people who showed you humanity when humanity cost them something. The Price Morrison wasn't unique in his defiance, but he was lucky. Many soldiers who violated non-fraternization policies faced consequences ranging from reprimands to courts-martial to prison time. Private Robert Hartman, Munich garrison, court-martialed August 1945 for unauthorized distribution of military supplies to enemy civilians. Sentence: 6 months military prison, dishonorable discharge. Corporal William Foster, Stuttgart, reprimanded September 1945, reduction in rank, transfer to non-contact position. Lieutenant Charles Martin, Frankfurt, formally charged with dereliction of duty after organizing systematic food distribution through church networks. Charges dropped only after German religious leaders testified to his actions preventing civil unrest. The official military history barely mentions these men. They don't appear in accounts of occupation policy or reconstruction efforts. Their names aren't in textbooks. But Anna Hoffman Schmidt remembered them. And when she spoke at reconciliation events throughout the 1980s and 90s, she always said the same thing. The real heroes of peace were the men who broke the rules when the rules were wrong. 2015 Berlin, 70th anniversary of war's end. The ceremony was formal, diplomatic, carefully choreographed. German and American officials spoke about alliance, shared values, mutual respect, all the official words for official history. But in the crowd, unnoticed by cameras, sat a group of elderly Germans holding photographs. Each photograph showed a different American soldier. Each one was labeled the same way. Unknown, 1945, thank you. They'd found each other online, these survivors and children of survivors, people whose lives had been saved by Americans, whose names they never learned. They'd formed a group, Das Chocolate Soldiers Memorial Project. Their mission: find the men who'd violated orders to show mercy and make sure history remembered. They'd found 43 so far, tracked down through military records, oral histories, exhaustive research. 43 names pulled from 7 decades of obscurity. James Morrison's name was on the list. So was his photograph, the official one from his service record. Young, serious, trying to look older than 22. Anna Hoffman Schmidt, 77 years old now, stood at the memorial they'd erected in Wiesbaden, a simple plaque listing the 43 names under a single inscription. They chose mercy when mercy was forbidden. They chose our lives over their orders. They chose a peace that began with bread. Below the names, a quote from Morrison's journal discovered only after his death in 2004. I thought I was just throwing away food. Turns out I was throwing away hate. One can at a time. In 1945, James Morrison made a choice. So did Margaret Hoffman. So did Sergeant Palmer and 10,000 other Americans who looked at orders that violated their conscience and said, no, not this, not now, not to children. They weren't saints. They didn't end the war. They didn't create the Marshall Plan or negotiate treaties or rebuild infrastructure, but they did something perhaps more important. They proved that enemies could choose to be human. That's not a small thing. It's not a footnote. It's the entire foundation on which reconciliation rests, the understanding that at critical moments individuals can reject what they're told in favor of what they know is right. Morrison never called himself a hero. In the letters he wrote home, he described his actions as common sense and basic decency. He said things like, anyone would have done the same. But that's not true. Not everyone did do the same. Many followed orders, exactly. Threw food in incinerators while children starved nearby. Maintained proper military discipline. Did their duty as defined by command. Morrison and men like him chose differently. And that choice, multiplied across thousands of small moments in hundreds of cities, created something unprecedented, an occupied population that didn't hate its occupiers. Think about that. Germany, 1945, total defeat, cities destroyed, families shattered, every reason to hate, and instead, because of cans thrown into alleys and boards left loose and supplies miscounted, the seeds of alliance. Anna Hoffman Schmidt died in 2019 at age 81. Her final publication, written weeks before her death, was titled On Mercy and Memory, Why We Must Remember the Small Acts. Excerpt, history celebrates the dramatic gestures, the treaties signed, the walls torn down, the speeches given, but transformation happens in quieter moments, in alleys, in the space between orders and conscience. In the moment, a soldier decides that feeding a child matters more than following regulations. My life is proof of this. I am alive because an American soldier chose mercy when mercy was punished. I built a career teaching peace because he taught me enemies could choose humanity. This is not a story about America saving Germany. It's a story about humans saving each other. About the moment we stop seeing categories, enemy, ally, German, American, and start seeing only this. Another person trying to survive an impossible situation. Remembering men like James Morrison isn't nostalgia. It's instruction. Because we will face these moments again. Different contexts, different conflicts, different enemies. And in those moments we will have to choose. Do we follow the orders that make sense on paper but violate conscience? Or do we choose mercy knowing it will cost us something? The men who threw cans into alleys chose mercy. And that choice, small, dangerous, technically illegal, changed the entire trajectory of two nations' relationship. Remember them, not as saints, as ordinary men who made an extraordinary choice when it mattered most. That's the lesson. That's what survives. In 2021, the Chocolate Soldiers Memorial Project donated its complete archive, photographs, letters, recorded testimonies, to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the German Historical Museum in Berlin. The collection includes 43 confirmed identities of American soldiers who violated non-fraternization orders, 271 testimonies from German civilians who received aid, 18 discovered K-ration tins, rusted but preserved, recovered from former depot sites, one Hershey bar, dated October 1945, kept in climate-controlled storage, 147 letters written by German civilians to unknown American soldier Morrison's journal, donated by his daughter Sarah after his death. The archive is open to researchers. Its existence is a reminder that the most important history isn't always the history that makes headlines. Sometimes it's the history that happens in alleys, at dusk, when no one is watching except the people whose lives depend on what happens next.